I had just finished my tuna salad sandwich when the clock struck 1 a.m. Watching that hand tick over the 1 was the sign that I had made it halfway through my shift, and the rest of the night was likely going to be a breeze. People almost never traveled the road after 1 a.m., so at the most, I'd probably have 2 or 3 more people over the next 4 hours looking to get some gas. The hooker and vampire crowd rarely made their way to my place of employment, Earl's gas and stop in the middle of bumfuck nowhere, which was fine by me. I snagged a pack of Reds from the cigarette rack behind me and tossed a 5 and a couple of quarters in the register to cover the cost before walking over to the front door and stepping just outside. The cool night air hit and sent a chill up my spine, to the base of my neck. Just above me the neon sign hummed, interrupted by the only occasional pop. I looked up at it while I cast its dim red and blue glows down on my face. Earl's Gas and SDP. The O and the 2 apostrophes long dead. At least, as long as I'd been there, which at this point was pushing somewhere around 3 years. Fix your fucking sign, Earl. I mumbled to myself with a laugh as I held the cigarette between my lips. You lazy old bastard. Earl was never gonna fix the sign, though. Earl never fixed anything. There was a shelf inside, and if you bumped it just right, it'd come crashing down. Probably would have only taken a couple of screws to fix it, and Earl refused. "Store's fine," he'd say in his crotchety old man voice. "You act like it's falling apart or something." His tone became clearly more accusatory with the second part of his statement. "I'll fix it," I'd said to him, only to be dismayed with a wave of the hand and grumble about liability insurance. The shelf itself remained stocked with paper goods to avoid any potential breakage, and I eventually gave up the argument. I was only 3 puffs into my cigarette when a dark red Honda came rolling up the road and pulled into the station. The car was coated with a layer of dirt that shone prominently underneath the harsh fluorescence that hung above the pumps. Couldn't see the driver through the windows. The light simply reflected the world around the car, rather than giving me a glimpse inside. The car sat idling for a few moments, the buzz of the lights and the sound of the grumbling engine being the only sounds cutting through the otherwise quiet night. I felt an uneasy vibe in the air as I watched the mysterious new arrival. I could see stilted movements from inside the car, but was unable to make out any defining shapes. Suddenly the engine shut off, and after a few moments of silence I heard muffled shouting. I saw the car rock back and forth for a few moments. Threw my cigarette down, ready to go check on what was happening. The feeling of unease replaced by a very real anxiety. As soon as I turned my first step away from the front of the store, though, the driver's side door swung open, and a man stepped into the light. He was probably in his early 40s. His hair was thinning on top of his head, and stubble framed his wide-cheeked face. He was wearing a striped-down button shirt, with short sleeves and a black tie dangling loosely from his neck. His eyes caught mine, and he froze for a second, suddenly becoming aware that I'd been standing there the whole time. "Hey, you alright, man?" I took another step forward as I spoke. The man looked truly disheveled as he walked around the front of his car. This became more apparent. His clothes were caked with dried mud that flecked off his khaki pants as he walked past the pumps in my direction. I'm fine," he spoke in a low and timid voice. I've just had a long night." He avoided my eyes as he walked past me into the store. I noticed even more dried mud on the back of his shirt and his skin. There were little rips in his clothes. I could see scratches on his arms. One of his hands looked as if he'd had a makeshift cloth bandage. Just a piece of torn shirt wrapped around the palm. I could see blood staining the edges. It looked as if he'd had a long night. Hell, it looked as if he'd just fallen down a rather steep hill and gotten in a bad fight with every rock on his way to the bottom. Sparing one last glance back at his car, I followed him into the store. As I walked over to my spot behind the counter, the man weaved his way to the cooler in the back, pulled out a bottle of water. He cracked it open and drank the whole thing in just a few seconds. He took out 2 more and walked back up to the counter, spilling water still dribbling from his chin. "And a pack of lights," he said, dropping the water in front of me and fishing out his wallet. The look in his eyes was tired and defeated. Felt an urge to ask him if he was okay, but held back. Whatever had happened to him, it probably wasn't something he wanted to discuss with some shitheel gas station clerk in the middle of the night. 9:45, I said, grabbing his pointed-out brand of cigarettes from the rack behind me and handing it to him directly. Something told me he was going to need them handy. Anything else? He shook his head and dropped a $10 bill on the counter before rummaging through his pockets and bringing out a handful of change. He counted out 45 cents and handed it to me. I dropped it into the register without making my own count and handed him a $1 bill. He nodded at me with an odd look of relief. He shoved the dollar into his pocket and gathered up his cigarettes and the bottle of water. Before I could even thank him, he was walking towards the door. His mind seemed already a few steps ahead of him, and it dragged him along. I expected to hear the doorbell as the man headed back out to his car, but instead, he stopped just short of the door, then looked back at me. He stared at me for a few seconds, his eyes full of what looked like guilt. It made me feel uneasy enough to say something. "Can I help you with something else, man?" My hand went to the mini bat that Earl kept below the counter, just in case. "No, just..." He stuck the cigarette in his pocket and used his now free hand to wipe his brow. He looked exhausted and scared, not threatening. "Just be careful working out here at night. Okay, kid?" "Yeah, you got it, buddy." I nervously laughed at his sudden concern. Not sure what else to say. The whole situation was starting to get under my skin, and honestly, I just wanted him out the door. Yeah. Spoke to the night as he turned towards the door and opened it. I watched him, every step, as he got to his car and got in. I saw the spark of a lighter for a second, and then the engine started. I waited what felt like an eternity for him to pull away from the pumps, head down on the road. I could feel him looking at me from behind the reflection of his windshield. Just staring. I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew. When he finally drove off and vanished down the road, I realized I'd been holding my breath and gripping the bat with white knuckles. I let out a huge sigh of relief and forced a laugh, even though the general unease of the guy's presence had yet to leave me. I dropped my ass on that little stool behind the counter and put my face in my hands. Perils of the night shift. Sometimes you get a weird customer, I thought to myself. At least it'll be a nice little anecdote for my friends later. I laughed into my palms and shook off, finally lifting my head and opening my eye. And I nearly fell off my chair when I saw someone standing in front of me. He had come out of nowhere. The bell over the door never rang when he entered. I didn't hear a car pull up, no footsteps to the store as he walked up to the counter, not even the itching feeling of presence when someone's close to you. He was like a ghost. The way he looked certainly didn't help in dampening the shock either. He was tall, well over 6 feet if I had to guess. He stood with his head bent down toward me and his hands flat on the counter. There was not a single hair on his head, nor face, nor even eyebrows. I could see the fluorescent light reflecting off his cue ball-like skull. His skin was pale and veiny, just on the verge of looking translucent. It looked as if you'd stuck him under a black light, he would glow. He was dressed in a black turtleneck, black dress-down pants. Something told me that if I looked down below the counter, I would see well-taken-care-of dress shoes with a mirror shine that equated to that of his head. The strangest aspect was the expression that he wore on his face. An unsettling, stiff smile stretched up the corners of his mouth, yet he kept his thin lips in a tight line. Even stranger, his eyes were closed. Yet, his head tracked me as I got up off the stool and kept away from the counter far enough that I could feel the price boards of the cigarettes against my back. Can I help you? My voice cracked as I spoke and my eyes flicked to the front window. No car was out by the pumps. I tried to tell myself that he was just a part of the late night, the hookers and vampire crowd. Out for a stroll, maybe, at nearly 2 a.m., a minimum of 10 miles from anything else, in either direction. He tapped his fingers against the counter and slowly turned his face towards the pumps before slowly turning back towards me, as if he was looking at me through his eyelids. He raised a hand from the counter and pointed down before slowly shaking his head. No. Listen, man, if you don't want anything, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. I didn't even sound brave to myself, let alone anyone else. He pressed his pointed index finger against the counter and again shook his head. No. My eyes moved below where he was pointing to and saw the mini-bat. This guy warning me not to go for the mini-bat? How? What the fuck? The realization swirled in my head as I attempted to swallow my heart back down in my body after its sudden jump to my throat. He cocked his head to the side and his smile went crooked for a moment before he turned his head back to me. I saw his hand go up towards his face. Heard something like a hiss of air preceding a wet crunching noise. I stepped forward to grab the mini-bat and his other hand shot up from his side and his fingers wagged back and forth as if to say... Another wet crunch came, followed by what sounded like spitting and laughing at the same time. The man quieted himself and turned back towards me. That same oddly stretched out smile was on his face, but blood leaked out of his closed left eye. He held up the hand that he had to his face, and the tip of the finger that he'd previously pointed down at the mini-bat was now missing. Blood streaked down over his hand and down the sleeve of his turtleneck. I shrunk back at the disgusted sight. As he aggressively knocked everything from my countertop onto the floor, the look on his face changed, even as various knickknacks scattered the floor and the register spilled cash and change out at his feet. He ran his still intact hand over the clean white countertop and nodded yes. Not to me, but to himself. Satisfaction with a job well done. I knew what he was about to do, and all I could do was watch in curious and horrified silence, frozen with my back against the cigarettes. It's here. The words, scrawled crudely by the mutilated finger, more quickly followed. He took it from us. The man raised his intact hand again from another gesture to signify that taking from them was probably not a good idea. His left eye flicked wildly behind his bleeding eye socket. It looked as if he was pulsing. I don't even know who you are. I jumped in an attempt to defend myself before I even knew what the fuck was going on, a pointless effort. The man held up the intact finger once again and put it to his lips. That stretched smile never changed. Yet I could somehow hear him me. The man lowered the finger and his lips began to part, revealing that there was something in his mouth, something large that appeared to be the cause of his silence. His eyelids opened as well, slowly revealing dark voids beyond. My eyes went again to my mini-bat, but there was a wonder if it would even do any good. Something that looked like a tongue quickly shot from inside the darkness of his left eye socket and cleaned the blood from around it. An involuntary reaction struck me, causing me to attempt to climb away on the cigarette display for a second out of pure revulsion, a feeling that would wash over me increasingly. In the coming moments, his mouth opened, fully revealing what he held inside. A massive eye flicked back and forth between the thin lips, and his eyelids curled upwards in a smile, revealing small rows of pointed teeth. Individual tongues licked around the eyes or mouths like a normal person would lick their lips. Confusion and horror froze me into place as I watched the body of the thing in front of me twist and contort. I managed to unglue myself from my spot long enough to make an attempt for my weapon, while it was still distracted with whatever the hell it was doing. The hand, missing a finger, darted over the counter and grabbed the small bat before I could reach it, its arm bending in odd ways and making horrible breaking and cracking noises as if defying its own design. As it swung the bat once in front of me and then threw it across the store, I could hear one of the glass cooler doors shatter. The eye and the mouth fixated on me as I stepped back again and watched the rest of its transformation in horror. Too scared of how quick it had been to even try and make any kind of move. It turned its back to me, but quickly bent its spine and neck, causing its head to fall lazily backwards like the neck had been snapped. Its arm bent oddly, the fingers twisting and the shoulders rotating so the elbows bent the wrong way became more like the right way. Its remaining fingers found purchase on the counter. A split began to form at the top of its head, the top now facing down towards the counter, and thick, soupy liquid with the dark red color of blood began to leak out. The mouths laughed as the crack got longer and wider, splitting them apart and stopping just short of the smiling eye. White points began to jut out of the edges of the seam like small teeth, and a large tongue lolled out, lapping itself against the counter as the two small mouths alternated between hissing and giggling. It lurched forward and scrambled over the counter, its legs seeming to come ahead of its arms. Out of instinct, I dodged out of the way of the horror now coming at me. I smashed full force into the display of cigarettes, sending unopened packs sprawling across the floor. As it scrambled to get back into its odd, crab-like walk position, I darted forward and leapt over the counter to make for the door. It managed to turn just in time to catch my foot with its mandibled hand and trip me up. I slammed down onto the other side of the counter and smashed my shoulder on the floor. As I attempted to recover myself, the thing crawled over the counter, getting between me and the door, blocking my route of escape. I slid backwards on my ass across the down of one of the aisles, towards the coolers in the back, hoping that I could find the mini-bat. I worried that if I took the time to get to my feet, the thing would pounce forward again. But as it slid backward, it instead stalked me. The huge cyclopean eye mouth watching me intensely, the tiny cruel mouth eyes chattering and hissing, and the wicked tongue flailing back and forth from the center of its face. It jumped up on the shelves, crawling across them like an insect, keeping slow pace with me as my back moved ever steadily towards the cooler behind me, filled with tall boys and malt liquor. I could hear it laughing. It was toying with me, relishing in my fear as it defied logic with its movement and existence in general. I slid out of the aisle to see the broken cooler, sodas spilled all over the floor, and the mini-bat lying among them. It was an aisle away, and I knew I was going to need to get to my feet to make it over there. I looked back to the thing as it moved towards me, still crawling over the shelves like a spider, moving through its web towards a fly. Suddenly its hand gripped at a shelf that I knew very well, a shelf filled with paper towels and plates because it couldn't hold much weight. As it shifted its weight, the shelf came free and the creature, which had been displaying a disturbing grace, suddenly fell sprawling onto the floor with the contents of the shelf spilling down on its deformed body. I sprung to my feet without thinking and tipped the whole damn shelf over onto it as it attempted to flail itself back to its feet. The heavy unit came down with a thud on its body, trapping it. I could hear it screaming, and the tiny mouth shouting what sounded like curses in some language that I couldn't understand. It pushed itself up against the weight, now pinning its body to the floor. I dove towards the mini-bat and snatched it up from a cold pool of soda. The thing had pulled its body halfway free as I ran back over to it and brought my tiny Mountain Dew-soaked club down on its arm. It howled in what I could only assume was more pain than anger, and reached out for my leg. I stepped back and brought the bat down repeatedly, 2 more times onto its arm and then 2 more times onto that hideous head. The seam widened and more of that viscous blood-like liquid leaked out onto the floor. I could see tiny teeth fly out from the small mouth and eyes, and the skull cracked, and finally, with one more brutal blow, the eye mouth popped like a balloon, and a pus-like liquid squirted out over the floor and mingled with the soda dripping from the bat and the oil-like blood. The thing fell still. I poked it a couple of times with the bat, wondering if I should hit it again and just run out of the store. It didn't move. And judging from the chunks of brain matter and skull scattered over the floor, I decided it was dead. I stepped over its body and around the knocked-over shelves on my way out to the counter. I needed to call somebody, the police maybe. What would I even say? It was as I crossed in front of the store's front window that I noticed them. Standing beneath the harsh neons of the sign outside and backlit by the fluorescent that hung over the pub. There was at least a dozen of them standing perfectly still like statues outside. The lights gleamed off their bald heads. Each of them was dressed the same as the thing that I'd just killed. Their eyes were closed. Their pale, thin lips were pulled tightly, closed into that same half-smile. The closest one stepped forward and opened the door, and the rest followed closely behind. I gripped the mini-bat tightly in my fist, feeling the blood of the one that I'd killed drip down over my knuckles as I backed away. They funneled towards the door in a wedged pattern, the leader walking steadily closer to me, his eye mouth open to reveal a black iris, a pupil shifting between his lips for a few seconds before it looked over towards its fallen double. I backed away, my feet kicking the change and bills from the fallen cash register out of the way as I moved. The thing kept pace. The other ones behind it were now opening their eyes and their small mouths began to whisper and laugh. Come on, then. I found myself screaming at them, now so certain that I was going to die that some kind of bizarre calm that replaced my fear was transitioning into bravery. I'll fuck you all up. Who's first, huh? One of them broke off from the back and walked towards the fallen one that left the shelves of its body. The ones still approaching me began to split from the top of their heads, their seams opening to reveal their long, pointed tongues. The ones in the back began to twist and contort into their more unnatural, spider-like forms as the leader walked through the change at his feet. And suddenly, it raised its hand and they all snapped back into their mock-human forms in an instant. As if their transformation was on a rubber band, and they just pulled them back into place. I stood there, holding the bat out in front of me as if that it would keep them from lunging forward and tearing me to shreds. They didn't leap forward, though. They stopped dead in their tracks, in fact. All but the two who had lifted the shelf from their dead. They were now carrying the limp, twisted corpse back towards the door. The one in the lead knelt down amongst the money sprawled out at his feet and began to pick through the coins with its slender, pale fingers, tossed them aside one by one until it found what it was looking for. It picked up a quarter from the pile and held it up to the black eye behind its lips as if studying it. Out of curious instinct, I lowered the bat and leaned forward to see that the small silver coin was not a quarter. In fact, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. It shimmered with different colors as it turned in the light. Purple, green, red, and blue. All a matter of a single twist of the wrist. The thing closed its massive eye back into an unassuming, tight-lipped smile, seemingly satisfied with its examination. It dropped the prism coin into its palm and closed a fist around it before standing back up. The others behind it began to shuffle out the door behind. And all I could do was stand there puzzled at what the fuck was happening. The others had nearly all left the store when the leader turned its back to me and walked over to the counter, pointing down towards what the first one had written. It's here. He took it from us. The change the man had given me. It clicked in my mind. I hadn't even bothered to count it. I just dropped it into the register without looking at it. Whatever he'd stolen from these things, he'd given it to me. To throw them off his trail. To hide it. To fuck with me. Didn't really matter. They'd found what they were looking for. It pointed its other finger towards the mess from where I'd killed the first one that arrived, and I could see it shaking its head yes. In approval. It set the coin on the table for a moment, and without turning to face me, it gave a slow, soft round of applause. The fucking thing was clapping for me because I'd killed one of its kind. It picked the coin back up and walked out the door, joining the other. I stood there confused and terrified as I watched the bald, twisted creatures walk out past the edge of the gas station lights and into the darkness. I stood there then, and long after.